So, like I said, when we talk about these issues, when we try to talk about these issues in the public square, of course, we get pushback. And in this talk, oh, good. It's not up there yet. And on this talk, I'm going to give you some tips on why it is so hard for us to speak into the public arena and how we can be more effective. And I realize that we want to make sure we leave time for questions, so I might sort of skip through the very first part of this, because it starts out telling a little bit about my own story, and that's not so relevant to the. It might be fun, but it's not quite as relevant. So I'll sort of hop, skip, and jump through this. And why I discovered the importance of Christian worldview. I was raised in a Lutheran home, and about halfway through high school, I just started asking, how do we know Christianity is true? Public high school, secular teachers, secular textbooks. I literally didn't have any friends who were Christian. I was in New Mexico. I literally had no friends who were Christians that I knew of. And I started asking questions. I asked a Christian college professor, how do you know Christianity is true? And he said, works for me. That's it? That's all you got? And I had a chance to talk to a Christian seminary dean, and I thought maybe I'd get something more substantial. And he said, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes, as though it were a psychological phase. So I very consciously rejected my Christian faith, my Christian upbringing, about halfway through high school, and started on an intentional search for truth. So I realized pretty quickly that if there was no God, there is no truth. There's no way to know it. There is no foundation for ethics. There is no meaning to life. We're just on a rock flying through space. I was the one arguing with my friends at a friend of mine said, oh, she's so wrong. And I said, you can't say anyone's right or wrong. So I was I was the moral relativist. So I was very primed when I finally went to L'Abri. I was going to school in Germany and happened across L'Abri, which is in Switzerland. And I wanted to give you a few pictures of what that looked like back then. This was in 1971. That's Francis Edith Schaeffer, and everyone lives in chalets in Switzerland. It sounds kind of like luxurious, but no, that's just the kind of houses they have in Switzerland. And you have to get a look at the Swiss Alps. Can you imagine waking up to that every morning? If nothing else, if the apologetics doesn't persuade you God is real, the sheer beauty is going to persuade you. So right from the beginning of my Christian life then, I became a Christian through L'Abri. I understood that Christianity is a full-blown worldview. I had this holistic vision. And that Christianity speaks not only to our spiritual life, but also to our professional life, education, law, politics, economics, the arts and culture. One of my students in my grad class last night gave his testimony, and he was raised as a Christian, and he was sort of a cultural Christian, and he faced a crisis of life where he had to, and he didn't even want to tell us about it because it was so recent. He said, I'm going to start crying if I tell you. So I don't know what it was, but he said, I realized I needed something much deeper, and he had a real spiritual experience. And you know how he phrased it? He said, I realized Christianity wasn't just about faith, it was really true. And I thought, that's what many of us really do think. We wouldn't maybe put it that way, but he said, if it was just faith, I had the sense almost that I'm making it true by believing it. You know, if I stop believing it, it won't be true anymore. And the spiritual experience brought him past that to realize, no, it's actually true of reality. So I thought that was a good way of putting it. It's not just faith, it's really true. And that's what many people got from Francis Schaeffer as well. So how did so many Christians lose that sense? Why do so many people think it is just faith, and they don't really have a sense of its truth? The answer is that many of us have been influenced by a secular view of truth. We've imbibed that. What is a secular view of truth? Most civilizations have held that reality consists of both a natural order and a spiritual / moral order. And that these are all part of the same. They're integrated into an overall unity. And that means our knowledge is also an integrated unity. It's a single, unified system of truth. But starting with the scientific revolution, many people in the West came to think that the only reliable form of knowledge is scientific knowledge, not knowledge of the natural order, empirically testable scientific facts. Well, what does that imply for moral and spiritual truths? They can't be stuffed into a test tube and studied under a microscope. So many people decided they don't actually qualify as objective truth anymore. They are just a matter of your personal feelings and preferences. And so the concept of truth has been split. And I'm sorry, I didn't realize that was, okay, well, that's me. I found this only months ago. I didn't even realize it was there. Somebody was at L'Abri when I was there, and I'm in that side, the right side, with the long blonde hair. I found myself online, and I didn't even know. So I now have a photo of me at L'Abri, and you can see they were all hippies back then. That was part of the appeal of L'Abri, actually. Back then, hippies were, by definition, the cool kids. And I thought, wow, how are these Christians able to reach across that cultural divide and reach out to disaffected young people? Okay, so here's that divide that I mentioned earlier. It starts with a divide in the concept of truth itself. That's why it's so important, because if your concept of truth is divided, everything you look at will be divided. So when Schaeffer's books first came out, people didn't quite know what to do with this little image, the upper, lower story, the metaphor of two stories in a building. And many people just thought it was kind of a metaphor for talking about relativism. But it took years. Years later, I was studying what in secular academia is called the fact-value split. And I realized that's what Schaeffer was talking about. He didn't use that language, but you see how essentially that's what he's getting at? In Total Truth, I wrote about it. I said, what Schaeffer was talking about was what we now call the fact-value split. And all of a sudden people said, oh, that's what he meant. I even talked to a Christian philosopher, and he said, look, I was involved in getting Schaeffer's books published, and I've warned my students for years about the fact-value split, and I never made the connection. So people hadn't quite figured out that this is what secular people mean by the fact-value split. Why is this so important? Because the fact-value split functions as the most powerful gatekeeper in the public square. So we all know what happens when you try to bring a Christian perspective on some issue. You get pushback. You can't bring a Christian perspective into politics or into the public squares, public schools, or the healthcare, or the workplace, right? We've all heard that. Why not? Because that belongs in the upper story. It's okay to believe it, but keep it in the private realm of family and church. Don't bring it into the public square. Let me show you how this is taught in the university classroom. It is taught in virtually every subject area. Here is a typical college textbook. Facts are objective. They can be measured and the truth tested. Value judgments, on the other hand, are subjective, being matters of personal preference, based on personal likes and feelings rather than on facts and reasons. Now, this is an economics textbook. You wouldn't think students in an economics class would be getting moral philosophy, but it permeates every subject area. Now, many of you have probably used the term values, defending Christian values, and this is not what you meant by the term. When Christians talk about values, they mean objective moral truths. So the central strategy in the secularist playbook is to deny that there are such a thing as objective moral truths. That's what it means to put them in the upper story. See, in the past, most people did think morality was objectively true. It was rooted in human nature. that morality was just as true as science. So what we have to understand when we talk to secular people today is they no longer think that. They have split off morality from the main body of knowledge and tossed it into the upper story as a kind of attic where you put things that no longer have the status of knowledge, but only personal feelings. Now, how do we run into this in ordinary conversation? We often hear people say, "Don't impose your values on me." But we never hear people say, "Don't impose your facts on me." Right? What's the difference? Because facts are assumed to be objective and universal, and values are a matter of personal choice. Here's how Stephen Carter puts it. He teaches at Yale University, and he says, elite culture treats religion as something private and trivial, like building model airplanes, just another hobby. Not something to be mentioned in serious discourse. So he wrote a book complaining about, as a Christian, I can't talk, in my environment at Yale University, this is what I encountered. Now, on the other side, here's a biologist who's an atheist who wants to see religion marginalized. He said, I look forward to the day when religion is treated as a pastime that people do for fun on the weekend, like knitting, something that doesn't really affect their life. At a conference on science and religion, there was a philosopher from Cambridge University whose background was Jewish. And listen to how he was interviewed, the reporters come to the conference and interview these guys. And he told a reporter, I stand in my synagogue and I pray to God, and I have an intense relationship with God, but I don't believe in God. And that's what the reporter said. What? Does this make sense? And here's how he explained it. Listen to this. He says, religion is like reading a novel. You can get pleasure and meaning out of the experience, even though you know it's not actually true. So for secular people, when we talk about God as real, it's like talking about Harry Potter as a real person. The upper story is not even a matter of true or false. Like a novel, it's not technically it's not true or false, it's a story. The postmodern view has filtered down even to the comics. This is a non sequitur comic strip, and I don't know if you can read it. I hope you can. So in the first frame, the father asks his young daughter, did you really tell your teacher that math is against our religion? No, the little girl replies, I said it was against my religion. So already you get this feeling, religion is something individuals make up. Danae, the father scolds, you can't arbitrarily make up a religion just to suit your needs. Oh, she asks, so how did all the other religions get started? And you see in the third frame, the father is befuddled, like, yeah. And in the final frame, the father's at a bar, and his drinking buddy asks, you've converted to what? Danaism. At least it's a religion that's honest about staying ignorant. So the final kicker, reveals the cartoonist's contempt, but the real message is in the middle frames. Religion is something made up arbitrarily to suit somebody's emotional needs. When this kind of view filters down to the comic strips, you realize this has permeated the whole culture. Oh, and not only the comic strips, but Star Trek, The Next Generation. The plot centers on whether one character is the Klingon Messiah, who has returned from death in fulfillment of prophecy, and the Enterprise's Klingon security officer has to decide whether or not the resurrected Messiah is real. You think they've got this plot from somewhere? And somebody challenges him and says, well, what empirical evidence is there for the truth of these claims? And he says, it's not an empirical matter. It's a matter of faith. It's a leap of faith. So what is Star Trek teaching people? That faith is contrary to evidence. That faith is blind. It's irrational. So if Christians were asked, about Jesus' claim to be the Messiah, what would their answer be? I mean, hopefully they would start talking about the historical evidence for the resurrection, the reliability of the eyewitness testimony in the New Testament, references to Jesus in sources outside the Bible, like the Roman historian Tacitus or the Jewish historian Josephus, the remarkably high quality of the New Testament documents, et cetera, how close they are to the original events, so there was not enough time for legends and myths to grow up. Christianity rests on historical evidence. Truth is not divided. Faith and evidence, are in harmony with one another. So what this means is, before we can make the argument of Christianity today, we have to first make the case for the Christian view of truth against the secular view. Schaeffer called this pre-evangelism. Pre-evangelism. And I'm speaking from personal experience here, because when I went to L'Abri, I was such a relativist that I first had to work through whether there was such a thing as objective universal truth before I could consider whether Christianity was that truth. It was a two-step process. So what are the social and political implications of this divided concept of truth, this two-story view of truth? If religion and morality are locked up in the private realm, the upper story, what's going to win in the public realm? Secular perspectives. Let me give you a few examples of how this works. Before the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, made same-sex marriage the law of the land, on a state level, it had already been imposed in places like Iowa. And look at how the state Supreme Court justice argued. This was in 2009, and it claimed that the pro-homosexual side presented an abundance of evidence and research. By contrast, the concept of marriage as a man and a woman was unsupported by reliable scientific studies. In fact, it was nothing but stereotype and prejudice. Well, if one side is scientific and the other is prejudice, who's going to win? And the same thing happened in California's Proposition 8, which also defined marriage as between a man and a woman. The judge there was Judge Walker, who, by the way, was himself homosexual. He claimed that the pro-homosexual side presented overwhelming evidence. By contrast, supporters of Proposition 8 expressed merely private values which were irrational. So this is the main strategy in the secularist playbook, is to put Christianity to the upper story where it has no impact on the public realm. You see, you have to realize what the word values means for the secular person. It means literally what some group values. It's the verb. What you value, what's important to you, what you approve, what you like or dislike. And that's why, by the way, Judge Walker also said, supporters of Proposition 8 acted out of nothing more than sheer dislike of same-sex couples, animus against them. Remember, that means hostility or hatred. Notice that these liberal judges cannot even conceive of Christian morality as an objective truth, but only as hatred and prejudice. And it's no use to protest that, but these are our cherished values, or our deeply felt values, or traditional values, or sincerely held values. I can't tell you how many times I've seen Christians argue that way in the public square. They're shooting themselves in the foot because they're using emotive language. They're essentially playing right into the secularist the stratagem. They're adding fuel to the fire because, in a sense, essentially, they're admitting that to the secular person, they're admitting that my private values, that they are just private, that they're personal, that they're emotionally held, they're sincere, they're cherished. This is one way, perhaps the key way in which Christians and secular people are talking past each other. Schaeffer used to say we need to learn the language of whoever we're trying to talk to. Just like a missionary has to learn the language of the people group that he's going to, even if they speak English, we have to realize that they use language differently. And this is a key example. They use the word different, values different from the way we do. And if we don't know that, we'll be talking past them, and in fact, we'll be communicating. That we're communicating, you see, if values were really just private preferences, then it would be invalid for us to bring them into the public square. Because it's like saying, well, I prefer chocolate, therefore you must prefer it as well. I shouldn't impose my personal preferences on you. Of course not. So that's why you see the secular person bristle and say, you know, you can't impose your values on me, because to him, values are just private preferences. That explains why we get such a hostile response. My grad students like to say the fact-value split is the matrix. It's the mold, the understanding of reality that shapes people's thinking even when they don't know it. You know, sports teams would give anything to have the other side's playbook. Well, this is the secularist playbook. What about Christians? Do Christians have a split view of truth? Are we influenced by this? Of course. Let me give you a few examples. This was written by a young woman right before, right after. She just graduated from a Christian high school. And she was describing her first day of theology class, and she said, my teacher drew a heart on one side of the blackboard and a brain on the other side. And he told us that the two are as divided as the two sides of the blackboard. The heart is what we use for religion, and the brain is what we use for science. So how are students going to learn to love God with all their minds when they're being told the mind doesn't even apply to theology? This is how you get Christians who have a Christian heart and a secular mind. And what do we call this in the Christian world? We call it the sacred secular split. It's in a sense the Christian version of the fact-value split. And what it means is people think, well, Christianity is for church, for prayer, for worship, for Bible study, but they really don't know how to bring the Christian perspective into their business, academia, politics, and so on. And let me give you a few more examples. A few years ago, Delaware was in the news because they had instituted in the public schools an especially aggressive program for teaching evolution. I've written a lot on evolution and science issues, so most of my examples are going to be from science. And a reporter came up to a 15-year-old Christian student and asked her what impact this new class had had on her religious beliefs. And she said, it didn't have any impact on my beliefs. Why not? She said, well, religion is what you believe because of faith. With science, you need evidence and need to back it up. I'm guessing she watched too much Star Trek. Remember, faith is not about empirical evidence. Or like my student last night who said, you know, when he finally realized Christianity is not just a matter of faith, it's really true. Well, she hasn't figured that out yet. She thinks it's still not really true. Or let me give you an example on the college level. PBS put out an 8-part series that was titled Evolution. And so I went to their website to learn more about it. And there was a web page that was a statement by 2 students who were identified as science students attending a conservative Christian college. Now, I happen to know that it was Wheaton College. They didn't say that, but I know that's where they did the filming. So this was Wheaton, and they were explaining why they could accept evolution. And they said, science deals with the material world of genes and cells, religion with the spiritual world of value and meaning. You see how they've absorbed the fact-value split? And is this really true? I mean, does Christianity have anything to say about the material world? Like the origin of the world? About events in history, like the Exodus in the Old Testament, or the resurrection in the New Testament. Did these things happen in the physical realm? But these students were willing to say that Christianity had no cognitive content. And sometimes the sacred-secular split causes young people to lose their faith altogether. When Total Truth came out, I was living in Washington, D.C., and I had a lot of friends working on Capitol Hill. So they wanted to do a book launch on Capitol Hill, and it was in the Senate office building. And after my presentation, a chief of staff stood up and said, "I lost my faith at an evangelical college." So of course I had to track him down and get his story. And he said, the professors taught the prevailing theories in their field. They just taught whatever the textbook said. And although they went to church on Sunday, and were probably very sincere in their faith, he said the secular textbooks were often, first of all, secular, and often even hostile to Christianity. So he said, I tracked them down. I went and knocked on their door during office hours, and I said to them, how do you relate your Christian faith with what you're teaching in the classroom? And he said, not one of them could give me an answer. And eventually, he gave up his Christian faith. He said, I decided it was a matter of intellectual honesty, that if you couldn't support it rationally, you need to give it up. And fortunately, he did come back to Christianity many years later. He said he discovered apologetics. He discovered people like Lewis and Schaeffer. Those were the key ones. And as he put it, I studied my way back to God. And then a nice phrase, I studied my way back to God. So how common do you think this is? This was a 2007 survey of colleges in the Coalition of Christian Colleges and Universities, which are the evangelical colleges, if you're not familiar with it. The CCCU is the evangelical colleges. Found that only half the faculty said they were confident they could integrate faith and learning in my discipline. That's not what you think when you send your kids off to Christian college, is it? That maybe only half their professors will be able to. My friend who said he had to study his way back to faith had the 50% who couldn't do it at all. He didn't find a single professor. So how can you tell if somebody's absorbed that split view of truth? This is from an apologist whose name is Brett Kunkel. He works for a group called Stand to Reason. Some of you know Stand to Reason? I see some heads nodding. So he tried it with a church youth group. And first he explained what's the definition of the terms, objective, subjective, right? Objective doesn't mean we know it for sure. I may be doing a difficult math problem and I'm not sure I have the right answer, but I am sure there is a right answer. Right? It's not just like a preference for vanilla or chocolate. It doesn't mean everyone agrees with you, and so on. You have to explain what objective means. And then he gave some examples like, that guy's shirt is black. Objective. Black is definitely the coolest color. Subjective. 5 plus 7 is 12, objective. Then he said, God exists. How many high school students said that was objective? 75% said it was subjective. Then he said premarital sex is wrong. Only one student said that was objective. All the rest said subjective. So you should try it sometime if you're in a youth group, if you try it with your own kids. I made it an assignment for my grad students. They had to go find a group and ask them this question. At the time, I was teaching junior high homeschool students. So I tried it with junior high kids. And instead of premarital sex, since they were younger, I said stealing is wrong. Their knee-jerk response was, oh, that's subjective. I said, why? Somebody just made that up. That's the tone. I'm giving you their exact tone. Somebody just made that up. I said, ever heard of the 10 Commandments? And they said, whoops. And these were homeschooled students from strong Christian families, who are not as exposed to the secular world as many other kids are. And they still, and junior high had so absorbed the culture that their knee-jerk reaction was morality is subjective. Oh, and by the way, there's a postscript to this. So Brett Kokel, who invented this little test, started teaching as church leaders, started telling them about his test to help them realize what they're up against with their young people. The youth group leaders, the youth pastors, didn't see the problem. They all thought the same way. So he realized this is not just our kids. Even our youth pastors have bought into the notion that Christianity is just in the upper story. Here's an example I clipped from the newspaper. There's a English professor at a conservative Christian college. And as an English professor, he was having his students write journals. And he said he was stunned by what they wrote. On one page, they would describe their intense worship experiences. And on the next page, they would describe their sexual exploits. And here's how he summed it up. He said, most of my students are rampantly promiscuous. There's a significant gap between what they profess to believe and how they live. By the way, this was Eastern College. What does this tell us? That a subjective, upper story Christian ethic does not have the power to transform our students' lives. They end up living just like secularists. And if they can't live out their faith in private, they certainly are not going to live it out in public. During a presidential election a few years ago, a reporter from ABC News interviewed several teens who had come to New York City for a rally. These were teens from all over the country who had committed enough to travel to New York City to do a protest in Times Square on the pornography, objectifying women's bodies and all that. But there was an upcoming presidential election, so the reporter asked them about that. And what he found is that most of them were pro-life. This was good. Most of them said they were pro-life. But they said they were going to vote for candidates who were pro-choice. And to the secular news reporter, that sounded like a contradiction. I don't remember if it was Obama or Hillary, but one of them, I think it was Obama. And he said, doesn't this bother you, that you hold these two contradictory views? And one student was quoted saying this. He said, maybe a little bit, but it's all personal preference. I mean, you can't really pass judgment on somebody because that's their belief. Morality is all personal preference? I mean, we're talking about a president who's going to set public morality for the whole nation. This is not just their private belief. Where had they picked up such a relativistic view? You see, it is perfectly possible to hold a Christian ethic within a secular view of truth. Do you see the difference? They had a biblical ethic, but they placed it in a secular view of truth, so they were placing it in the upper story where it was just personal preference. Now, what happens when these teens go into the workforce? This is a personal story. My oldest son had a crisis of faith as a young adult, and he had dropped out. He was at Virginia Tech in the honors college, and we thought, we thought he was doing great, and he wasn't. He dropped out of school and started working in a bagel store. So this was a low. It really was a low point of his life, and he had a crisis and had a spiritual experience, which was wonderful. And he decided he'd get a job at a Christian bookstore so he'd have access to good Christian books. So he's leaving to go interview for this job, and I stop him at the front door and I say, well, did you even call them and see if they had an opening? And he said, no, I prayed about it and I've got the job. Oh, that didn't sound like him. He had not talked like that ever before. So he goes to this Christian bookstore, and sure enough, that morning, 2 people had resigned. 2 people had quit. So he got the job. And by the way, this is a fun story. By the way, the other position was taken by a young black kid who was his same age, who had gone through a spiritual experience, conversion experience recently as well. And it also said, I think I'll work at a Christian bookstore to have access to good Christian books. And so these 2 guys found each other, and his story is told in Total Truth. If you don't remember what chapter it is, but if you read Total Truth, you'll find a story about a young black kid, and you'll recognize it because it starts out by saying he thought he was a Christian, and in high school he prayed to God to help him lose his virginity. Because all of his friends were bragging about the sexual exploits, and God wants me to be happy, right? So God wants me to lose my virginity. That was the level of his thinking before he had his conversion. So you'll appreciate it. It's a fun story. So he's working at a Christian bookstore. Christmas comes, and they decide to do a raffle. Typical fundraising gimmick. So customers come in, and they put their name on a little sheet of paper and put it in the bowl. Close to Christmas, they decide to announce the winner. So they pull out a name, read it, and toss it. It turns out they wanted to use the raffle to reward a loyal customer. So they just picked through until they found a name they liked and announced that person to be the winner. Now, these guys were sincere Christians, but is cheating really an acceptable way to run a business if you're a disciple of Jesus? Or does business belong to the secular realm, where a different set of rules apply? Or consider another example, and again, this is somebody I know personally. A man underwent a dramatic conversion experience in midlife and eventually rose to leadership within a major international Christian ministry. But secular ways of doing business were so ingrained that he resorted to them without even thinking. For example, as you may know, this is very common in Christian ministries. To raise money, he used statistical tricks to shade the numbers and make his ministry seem far more effective than it really was. Right? People want to give money to success, so you want to make your ministry look successful. But how common do you think that is? This was a study done by Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. 250 of the 300 largest international Christian organizations regularly mislead the Christian public by publishing demonstrably false, incorrect or falsified progress statistics. And let me give you one more surprising statistic. Just because Gordon Conwell put out several of them, and this one will surprise you as well. Trusted church treasurers are embezzling each year $16 billion out of church funds. Annual church embezzlements by top custodians exceed the entire cost of all foreign missions worldwide. So what do these numbers tell us? The sacred-secular split is deeply embedded, even in the minds of many people who consider themselves Christians. And I would suggest this is the major reason Christians have so little impact on the wider culture. So, and this is really what people mean when they talk about a Christian worldview. It's not something abstract or intellectual. It just means getting out of the sacred-secular split and realizing that Christianity applies to all of life. Here's how I explain it to my students sometimes. There are what you might call two versions of Christianity. We might call them the Genesis 1 version and the Genesis 3 version. So what do we read about in Genesis 3? The fall, right? The fall into sin. And if you start there with your message, you get the classic revivalist message. You're a sinner, you need to get saved. And that's true. But it does tend to lead to a sacred-secular split. Why? Because it communicates that the essential identity is to be sinful, to be fallen, that the world is inherently corrupt. And there's nothing of real value in this world. This is where we get students who say, I was always taught spirit good, body bad. And as a result, many Christians tend toward the ark mentality, right? That this world is headed for destruction. Our purpose is to save people out of the world. And there's little sense that your secular profession can be a spiritual calling. And because our professional work, our secular quote-unquote professions, take up most of our waking hours, that means a huge part of our life is sealed off from what matters to us most. Our discipleship is sort of compartmentalized into one small part of our life. And we're not going to really experience the joy and the power that God promises us in Scripture. Dorothy Sayers, how many of you know Dorothy Sayers? You should know her if you haven't heard of her, because she was a good friend of C.S. Lewis's, and also wrote a lot of essays. She wrote on the importance of understanding the Christian view of work. She said, if religion does not apply to our work, then it does not apply to what we do with 8/10 of our life. And no wonder people say Christianity is irrelevant. God's truth is meant to be a light to all our paths, including the paths we walk during the workday. So, what is a Genesis 1 version? So, Genesis 1 starts with creation, right? And in the biblical account, we read what we might call the first job description for the human race. Okay? God has created the world, living creatures, human beings, and he tells them what they're there for. What are we here for? What's our purpose? Be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. So be fruitful, in the very streamlined language of Genesis 1, does not mean just have families. It means all the other social institutions that historically grow out of the family. So what it really means is to develop the entire social world. One of my students this semester works for the city of Houston. I teach at Houston Baptist University. She is a high-ranking official in the city of Houston and writes their regulations. So last night, we actually did this talk last night in my class. And I said, okay, her name is Tina. Tina, when you write the regs for the city of Houston, the last one, their laws, you are fulfilling the cultural mandate. You're not doing just secular work. What you are doing is a spiritual calling, because you are obeying the cultural mandate. Are you familiar with the term cultural mandate? People often refer to this verse, be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth, as the cultural mandate, because it means our job is to build cultures. And let's go to the second one. Subdue the earth means develop the natural world. Plant crops, build bridges, and so on. A student once asked me, what do you mean compose music? How is that, harnessing your natural resources? And I played the violin, so I said to him, what's a violin made out of? Wood. What's the bow made out of? Do you know what the horsehair? It's horsehair. I said, so all the transcendent beauty that you think of associated with music starts with products from the natural world. And so it's the cultural mandate, because what it says is God calls us to build cultures, civilizations. Think of it this way. When we sin, we get off the track. When we're saved, we get back on the track. But what was the track? What was the original goal that God created us for? Genesis 1 tells us, pre-fall, what we were called to do. Luther says we're God's hands, God's feet. God's eyes, God's feet. And he expands on it by saying, if God wants to, of course, he can do things miraculously. He can feed the children of Israel with manna from heaven. But most of the time, he feeds us through farmers, retail workers, food processors, and so on. If God wants to, he can heal us miraculously like Jesus did in the New Testament. But he's working just as much through doctors, nurses, healthcare workers. He raises children through parents, teachers, pastors, and soccer coaches. So what version do most churches teach, the Genesis 1 or the Genesis 3, in your experience? Most people tell me Genesis 3 is still the dominant view. And let me tell you, this is not just a problem for Americans. It's all around the globe. Let me give you some quotes from African theologians. You know that Africa has become rapidly Christian. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was less than 10%. Now, do you know what it is now? 40 to 50%. And in some, the northern part is Muslim, but in some sub-Sahara countries, it's 70 and 80%. Kenya, for example. So here's the problem, though. Many of these countries still suffer from poverty, disease, illiteracy, injustice, and violence. Why? Why isn't Christianity having a greater cultural impact? Because their Christianity is largely a product of missionaries bringing the same secular sacred split. Here's how one Canadian educator and missionary puts it. In places like Africa, Western missionaries generally brought the gospel in the way they learned it, as a purely soul-saving faith with no bearing on anything else. Religion was mostly a personal matter, nothing to do with things like politics, science, law, economics. And he concludes by saying African people were given the gospel, but not how to build a righteous nation, how to apply Christianity to everything. And so, just like the examples I gave from American kids, they end up, they go to church on Sunday, but end up living like pagans during the week. Or here's how one African theologian puts it. Churches have taught that Christ came to save only souls, not whole lives. So that large churches have been built. Thousands of people go to church each Sunday, but transformation of communities has not occurred. And one more, this is a South African theologian. If we want a new Africa, we need a new type of Christianity. And let me give you a short story that gives you an example of that new kind of Christianity. I'll leave you with a positive story. You've all heard this saying, if somebody's hungry, you don't give them a fish, you teach them how to fish. Right? But what if his worldview says that this world has no value? What if his worldview says, work in this world is not important, or the sacred secular split, it's of less value, or even that it's your life is subject to fate, and no matter what you do, you can't really change your life. It turns out the most important part of economic development is worldview. You have to address the worldview. In Guatemala, there's a group of Indians called the Pocomchi Indians. They're descended from the Mayans. And they're subsistent farmers. They're the poorest of the poor. And the traditional religions of this region are animist, spiritualist. So they teach that nature is filled with spirits that are much more powerful than you are. And you might be able to placate them a bit with putting out offerings, but essentially you have very little control over your life. It creates a passive, fatalistic, fear-based mindset. There's not really much you can do to change your life. People have the sense if you're poor, you're always poor. There's no use trying to better your life. Now, about a generation ago, missionaries came to the Pocomchi Indians, and many of them accepted Christ and became Christian. But they stayed poor. They knew they were saved, they knew they were going to heaven, but they didn't think Christianity meant anything for this life. They were essentially just waiting to die and go to heaven. We might say they were converted in their religion, but not in their worldview. They were still passive and fatalistic. Later, secular development organizations came with lots of money, and they built things like schools and latrines, a sanitation system. But when the groups left, the Pocomchis didn't use any of these expensive projects because they had not changed their life practices or their attitudes or their worldview. They were still passive and fatalistic. If you're poor, you always stay poor. Why send your kids to school to make a better life? Finally, a young Peruvian pastor came to the Pocomchi. His name was Arturo Cuba, and today he works with Food for the Hungry. But this was in the early 1990s, and Arturo taught the Genesis 1 version of Christianity that were created in God's image to have dominion over this world, not just wait for the next world. One reason the Pocomchi Indians had so little to eat was that they did not have effective food storage for their crops, and it kept being eaten by the rats. So the young pastor asked the farmers, "Who's smarter, you or the rats?" And the farmers laughed a bit sheepishly and said, "Oh, I guess the rats are." So who really has dominion here, you or the rats? And the farmers had to admit that in a real sense, the rats did. So the pastor taught them the biblical concept of stewardship, that God created them to be active instead of passive over against nature, to have dominion, to take initiative. They're called to be creative because they're created in the image of a creator. And so they developed a new method of grain storage. The food supply began to increase. The children had better nutrition. And this was the beginning of their climb out of poverty. They developed better farming techniques, started sending their children to school, and so on. And so it all began with a shift from the Genesis 1 mindset to the Genesis 3 to Genesis 1. That the Bible is not just for getting saved and going to heaven, but gives us principles to solve issues of poverty, corruption, and injustice. So this is God's job description for them and for us. How many of you know Lecrae? One day I started getting emails from friends saying, "Did you know Lecrae is recommending your book, Total Truth?" And my first response was, and who's Lecrae? I was not up on my hip-hop artist at the time. But for those of you who don't know, Lecrae was raised, his father abandoned the family at a young age. He got into drugs and alcohol and sex and gangs. He was so outrageous that his friends nicknamed him Crazy Cray. Eventually, someone shared the gospel with him. He became a Christian. But he said his life was not really transformed until he read Total Truth. The transforming point came when he understood that Christianity is not just religious truth, it is total truth. And so this is what, by the way, I met him. I had a chance to meet him when he had a concert in Houston. And he was kind enough to say, he said, I attribute the success of my music to your book. Because before that, I thought, I'm a Christian, I can write about salvation and sanctification and other spiritual issues. But when I read your book, I realized I can write about anything. God created the entire creation, and therefore anything you write about can be written on from a Christian perspective. You know, the lyrics can express a Christian perspective. So this is where, I think that's it, yeah. This is our strategy for reframing Christianity for the public square and getting it out of its compartmentalization and getting it first into our lives and then into our culture. And we do have some time for questions. And how does this work?
I don't know. We're going to find out.
Because you submitted questions from the first session. And I'm hoping you have some from the second session as well.
There she's back there now. Do you have the questions? Oh.
Oh, good. Yeah, intersex. That used to be part of my talk, but I had to cut it. So intersex people are simply people whose sexual and reproductive anatomy is atypical because of known hormonal and genetic malfunctions. In other words, gender identity, someone who claims to be transgender, there's no known cause. Intersex people, there is a known cause. There's several different types of intersex, and we know what causes it. It is genetic. It is, doctors can't identify where it's coming from. Unfortunately, intersex people are being used now as a sort of political football by people who want to destroy the male-female binary and say, oh, it's not just a binary, there's a spectrum in between. Well, of course, that spectrum is about this big. You know, it's very, very, very small. There's still very few people who are actually intersex. And what I say is, it does not prove that there's no binary. There's still only two gametes, right? There's sperm and there's egg. There's nothing in between. There's no spectrum in between. And biologically, we call the individual who has sperm, we call the male, whether it's humans or hummingbirds or hippopotamuses, or even flowers, right? The sperm is called the male. The individual who has eggs is called the female. So biologically, not just humans, but across the spectrum, all living things divide into male and female. All sexually reproducing species divide into male and female. There's not a spectrum, and let me give you an analogy. Intersex people are people who have anomalies such that they do not have sexual and reproductive function. Well, if my heart is not functioning well, the cardiologist does not say, well, heart's on a spectrum, and yours is just different. No, he says, let's work on this and improve the function. And in fact, that's what most intersex people do. They decide that they're either male, either predominantly male or female, their sense of gender identity, and they use hormones. They use hormones and surgery to align as either male or female. And this is where the surgery was developed, by the way, that's now being used by transgender people. It was originally developed for people who are intersex, or people who've had injuries and so on. When I was writing Love Thy Body, I was contacted by an intersex person, so I have her story in there, which is pretty cool. She's a Christian who was intersex, and her anatomy appeared to be more male than female when she was young, and so she was raised as a boy. And she always felt like a girl. She was very small for her. I mean, she was small even for a woman, so she's very small for a man, and people with intersex problems also have other genetic problems, usually. It's not just one thing. So she had, her jaw didn't develop right, so it was very pointy and small. She had a little pixie face. She was, in college, she was basically told that she was going to lose her scholarship if she didn't figure out her gender issues. It was that obvious. So she finally did a chromosome analysis and found out she was intersex. And she resolved it eventually by saying, I'm not a boy, I'm actually a girl, and resolved it with hormones and therapy, surgery. So that's what most intersex people do. They're perfectly happy to align with either the male or female. They do, intersex people themselves are not out to destroy the male-female binary. And as Christians, our job should be to welcome them, just like we do with anyone else who has any sort of physical anomaly. They're more ashamed of it because it applies to the sexual organs, but really, it's just like having a heart problem or any other issue. Christians should go out of their way to make them feel welcome and accepted and nurtured. And they should not be used as a political football by people who want to destroy the male-female binary. And I have a slide, but I think my slides have been taken down. I have a slide where this intersex woman said to me, I have the quote, where she said, it hurts to be shoved into the LGBT camp by either side. So that's the voice of a intersex woman. Do we have another question?
On the screen.
Yeah, it's back there too. No, but it is another version of intersex. Sometimes when you're intersex, it is true, because intersex doesn't only show up at birth. Your genes have regulatory proteins that turn your genes on and off. And so it is true that intersex can show up later because the genes turn on or off. So I think everything I just said applies here. How about the next question? Well, we can start with Genesis. Remember when I said, most of you have heard of Gnosticism, right? When I said earlier, the early church faced a world dominated by Gnosticism. Most of you know your church history, right? When I said over against the Gnostic view, which was that the world is a creation of a lower level evil deity, Christianity teaches that it's created by a supreme deity who's good, and therefore it is the created order, including the body, is intrinsically good. The fall doesn't get rid of that. We're all broken. Everything's been corrupted in some way by the fall, but that does not deny the intrinsic goodness. This is why you start with Genesis 1. If you start with Genesis 3, you do convey the idea that it's essentially broken and corrupt. But that is not the whole story. Schaeffer used to say this. He used to say, the Christian worldview doesn't start with Jesus died for your sins. The Christian worldview starts with, in the beginning, God created. Because if you don't have that, you don't know what Jesus is saving us to. He's saving us to recover the humanity that God created in the beginning. So that's the first one. 2 or 3 verses. it's difficult to admit that I can't remember exactly anymore what I wrote. I have a chapter on sexuality. I have chapters on so I have a chapter on abortion, on the value of human life, and I have Bible verses. I have quotes from the church fathers. I have a chapter on euthanasia, and again, I appeal to the scripture to show the value of life. I have a chapter on the hookup culture, and so I have the value of sexuality from the Christian point of view, and then transgender and homosexuality, which I dealt with more today, showing again that our argument should be positive. It should be showing that we honor the body. Christianity, the Christian sex ethic is based on honoring and valuing the body. Let's do another question. Who feels the energy of the earth? First of all, what I just said, we need to reframe our approach to people and help them to see we're not coming to them with just a negative argument. Yes, we don't compromise at all on the Christian ethic. We do think that we do read scripture to say that homosexuality is wrong and that God created sex for marriage. It's not just homosexuality. Any form of sexual expression outside of marriage is wrong. So, the hookup culture is just as wrong as the homosexual culture. And that's important, too, I think, for homosexuals to realize we're not picking on them. So first of all, reframing it in positive terms, honoring the body, respecting God's creation, living in alignment, living in a harmony with our body, with our biological sex. So reframing it will help a lot. But secondly, maybe not starting with that. Let me give you a story. Some of you know Tim Keller up in New York City. Most of you have read some of his books. I heard before he became famous, somebody gave me a huge bag of his sermon tapes. You know how long ago that was. Of his sermon tapes. And so I listened to his sermons long before he wrote his books. And one of his sermons, he tells this fascinating story. He said, after church one day, a woman came up to him and said, "So do you think abortion is wrong?" And he said, he gave a little longer answer, but ended up saying yes. And she said, "I'm starting to agree with you. I'm starting to think it's wrong too." And then as he talked to her, he found out she was a lawyer with NARAL. Do you know what NARAL is? National Abortion Rights Action League. This is one of the groups that has lobbied most powerfully, most intensively for abortion laws. It's like Planned Parenthood on steroids. And she told him, when I came to your church, if you had a table out with all kinds of pro-life pamphlets, I would have turned around and walked out. But because you didn't start with that, I stayed and listened. And he used that as an example of how we should approach people. We don't necessarily start with the controversial issues that they're most defensive about. And I have to tell you, the longer a person is a homosexual, the more defensive they become. And trans people too. I love the age of Facebook and Twitter because I do get a chance to interact often with people who come to my Twitter feed or my Facebook page who are very secular homosexual activists or transgender activists. And I'm happy for that, but I have discovered it's very hard to talk to them. They are so defensive, and they are so sure that you're just going to argue with them. You're just going to jump all over them. And I try to stay calm. I try to stay rational. And once in a while, I can get an abortion, too, by the way. I just recently got jumped on by some abortion activists. And sometimes I can get them to calm down and have a discussion, because I really do want to hear what they think and how they support their view. But it is very difficult. So why start with the area they're most defensive? Start by, how do we know Christianity is true? How do we know God is real? Start with the big questions. So that's what I would do with somebody like that. I would start with, how do we even know Christianity is true? If he no longer believes in God, he was probably like, well, like my student last night who said, I always thought it was faith. I thought it was faith and not really true. You know, he probably is coming from that perspective. Why not start with, how do we know what's true? Start with the big questions. Because remember, your morality is always derivative of your worldview. So if you don't have the right worldview, you're not going to have the right morality. Of course not. So don't start with the derivative. Start with the basics. Start by evangelizing this kid. And how do we know Christianity is true over against secular worldviews? How about a new question? By the way, are you sending in questions from the second talk as well? You can still do that, right? So that we, okay. So you can still be sending in questions, I think, if this works. Do we have another question? Yeah, you know, the last election was a tough one because Christians have always focused on personal character. And we have thought personal character is important because your personal character will determine your policies. Well, you know what? It doesn't always. Think back to President Carter. How did he get elected? Because he came across as a nice Southern Baptist Sunday school guy. And we all said, oh, one of us. And we voted for him. And once he got in office, his policies were terrible. Well, many of them were. Many of his policies were things we would disagree with. By contrast, in this last election, we had two people whose personal character was terrible. And so we were forced to base our judgment purely on policy. You know, whose policies are we going to agree with more? And, you know, it was a judgment call because we didn't really, well, Hillary, we knew what she was going to do. She told us. You know, she is definitely an ideologue, and she's clear about what policies she would have instituted. Trump was more of an unknown. But I guess as our culture secularizes, we're forced more and more into the position of saying, okay, we're going to have to make judgment calls based on their policies and whether we think their policies are good for the culture, because we're probably going to disagree with their personal, their personal character. And I'm not sure, but my guess is that as society secularizes, this will be more and more what we're up against. We'll have to make judgments on what we think, with policies that are good for the country. Because Houston just had a lesbian mayor, by the way. So, she was recently voted out. But when I've been in Houston for 6 years, and the first 5 years we had a lesbian mayor, and Christians were like, okay, how can we work with her? How can we work with her on policy, since obviously we're going to disagree with her personal morality? That's realism. Another question? Yeah, well, that's Ephesians, isn't it? Ephesians tells us we're not just up against flesh and blood, against humans, but against, powerful spiritual forces. And I think that is an important thing to keep in mind, so that we have kind of a twofold focus. On the one hand, the secular thinking is being written by real human beings. The philosophies that permeate our culture are coming from some human brain. And we have to treat people with respect and listen to their thinking and give them good reasons and arguments. This is what was so impressive about Schaeffer. When I asked questions as a teenager about to Christians who I knew, like I said, first of all, nobody could give me an answer. But what I didn't say earlier was, and most of them made me feel like there was something wrong with me for even asking. You should have faith. What's wrong with you? And at L'Abri, I encountered for the first time Christians who said, questions are good. Questions are fine. God's truth is big enough to stand up to whatever questions you raise. So I think Schaeffer used to say we need to give honest answers to honest questions. I like that phrase, honest answers to honest questions. And I think, and he would assume at the outset that they were honest questions. Because a lot of people say to me, yeah, but, people's questions aren't honest. Well, you can't assume that. It is very common for Christians to say, oh, well, there's really an underlying moral problem. Well, there may be, but we're complex beings made in God's image, so our mind is made in God's image still. So even if we have moral problems, that doesn't mean you shouldn't address their intellectual questions, when they're asking how do we know Christianity is true, because it's probably both. They may have honest questions and have moral problems. You deal with both of them. Or they may have psychological problems. And with Christians, often, it's conflict with their parents, right? Or conflict at church. Somebody's hurt their feelings. Somebody's damaged them psychologically. So there's all kinds of objections people can have, and we need to deal with all of them. So secular people are honestly, in many ways, honestly coming up with their secular ideas, and we need to treat those honestly. But we should always recognize, of course, that in the background is a spiritual battle going on, and stay in prayer and stay in dependence on God for the things we can't see, the unseen battles. Schaeffer used to say, sometimes it's hard for us to think the spiritual realm is as real as the physical realm. We live in an empirical age. Science has basically made us all empiricists. What we can see, hear, weigh, and measure is really real. And so Schaeffer used to counter that by not calling it the spiritual realm. He just called it the invisible realm. There's the visible realm and the invisible realm. It's just as real. You just can't see it. Or he would call it the unseen realm. And we all know from science that there's real things that you can't see. You can't see gravity, but that doesn't mean it's not real. You can't see force fields, but they're real. So just calling it the invisible realm can help us sometimes say, it's just as real. And we are called to live with the mindset of living in the invisible realm as much as in the visible realm. How about another question? I'm not quite sure what the question. Are you saying they don't want to hear something from the pulpit? Or are you saying they don't want to tell people to pray?
How do you see our Christian stewardship regarding our involvement in politics?
Yeah, well, I agree with you. I think that, well, let me maybe back up. There was a period, the fundamentalist era was the era where Christians were so alienated from the modern culture. At the late 19th century, there were all kinds of intellectual challenges coming up. Darwinism, and Marxism, and Freudianism, and higher criticism of the Bible, right? For the first time, you had a lot of theologians, especially in Germany, saying, well, the Bible's not really true, it's myths and legends. There were a lot of these were coming up in the late 19th century. And so this was a period when Christians were facing intellectual challenges that they hadn't faced before. And unfortunately, a lot of them, instead of developing an apologetic against these objections, sort of developed a fortress mentality, circle the wagons. And that's what we call the fundamentalist era that started in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. And it did some good things. They said, look, we're just going to focus on our own churches and our own schools and our own Bible camps and so on. And, they did keep Christianity alive to some degree, but they also tended to develop the mentality of, we don't corrupt ourselves getting involved with the world. And that's when you really got the message. The message became common that politics is corrupt. You don't want to get your hands dirty getting involved with politics. Well, we've come out of the fundamentalist era largely, but I think some of these attitudes still carry on. You know, you still find places where Christians think being involved in politics is inherently, you know, bad, corrupt. You know, politics is dirty. Politics is about compromise. And I think that the way to counter that is to get back to the big picture of what is a Christian worldview. Christian worldview says Christianity is not just about the spiritual realm. It applies to, okay, politics, economics, the arts, the business world. It applies to all of life. And a pastor who's saying that is probably doesn't have a full-orbed Christian worldview. Because just like Lecrae said in the lyrics to his songs, I am Christian when I talk about anything in God's creation because God created it. Anything that comes from the hand of God can be interpreted within a Christian perspective. And therefore, you can talk about any subject. So the pastor can talk about politics, but he can talk about economics, and he can talk about moral issues, and he can talk about the arts, and he can talk about entertainment, and he can talk about what do we do with, how do we be more biblical with our leisure time. You know, you can talk about any subject from the pulpit. Politics is no different. So if you've got that bigger mentality, it may take some of the pressure off. Well, we can't be political. No, you can talk about anything because anything belongs within a Christian worldview. So maybe backing up to that larger question of Christian worldview would be more effective. We have another question? Well, that's why, you know, there's been a couple of articles recently in Christianity Today and Tim Keller saying, oh, Christians think, you know, they need to stop idolizing the Republican Party. To which I've seen other people responding, who idolizes the Republican Party? You know, and I thought that was a good response. I think that is a straw man. Most Christians try to align with, in terms of politics, we're not Democrats or Republicans. We try to figure out how to be most effective in advancing policies we think are biblical. And sometimes those will be, some of those are advanced by the Republicans, and some of those might be advanced by the Democrats, or some, you know, by libertarians, people who maybe, you know, maybe some of the other groups like libertarians or the Constitution Party or some of these smaller groups. You know, my son voted for the libertarians in the last election. I said, you know, and then other people say, no, you're wasting your vote when you do that. But those are prudential judgments. You know, we've lost this. In the Middle Ages, when they had the different Christian virtues, you know, there was a virtue of prudence. And prudence meant when something is not necessarily right or wrong, but that is pragmatically a way to advance a Christian understanding, Christian principles. Like, you know, here's an example. The classic example is if you're living under the Nazis and you're hiding Jews in your attic, and the Nazis, you know, the SS knocks on your door and says, do you have Jews hiding in your attic? Well, there's a conflicting principle there. You don't lie. But the conflicting principle is you protect Jews. You protect people who are being hunted for, you know, killed by the government for bad reasons. You know, they're innocent people who are being killed by the government. Well, that's a conflict. Which one do you choose? That's a prudential judgment. There are two rights, you know. You know, two wrongs don't make a right. Well, two rights can be hard too. Those are two principles. And most people said, not lying is the one that you don't apply here. Protecting the Jews is the one you do apply. But they are both moral principles. And it's a prudential judgment which one applies when. So in things like political issues, these are prudential judgments. And you try to figure out how do we best advance Christian principles given the nature of our political system. And so most people I know are, you know, they're not partisan either way. They'll go with the Republicans for the areas where, and right now probably if you think about like pro-life, some of the things we care most about, most conservative Christians think the Republicans are closer. They have more things in common. But that's a prudential judgment. We don't have some kind of, we're not idolizing politics, as our critics like to tell us we are doing. I don't see Christians who are idolizing politics. So we need to recover the virtue of prudence, prudential judgments. Okay, next question. Yeah, this is, when I teach this in my classes, a lot of the times my students say, they're seeing for the first time how much they were living with that divided mindset. To some degree, I was trying to think how to get past, how to get past sort of the overarching principle is recovering the notion that Christianity speaks to all areas of life. Right, that Christianity is meant to, I think most Christians didn't even know, that is meant to apply beyond just morality and personal discipleship, personal life, personal relationships. I mean, that's what our churches address. And so on the one hand, you have to be really convinced, no, Scripture is meant to give principles for politics, economics, the arts, science, and so on. Once you accept that principle, you probably just have to get into each one and work out the specifics. Like, well, maybe I'll give you an example from science. So, there are Christian colleges that, this isn't being recorded, right? Is this being recorded? Can I name names?
I don't know if this is being recorded. Probably. I know about the QA. Is this being recorded?
I won't name names, but okay. There are a lot of Christian colleges that I'm familiar with where the teaching is still very much, the science, in several departments, but I'm going to focus on science, where the science department still basically teaches whatever the textbooks tell us, right? So the teachers go to church on Sunday, and when they have personal, yeah, I do. When they have personal spirituality, they're personally committed, they talk to their students outside of class from a Christian perspective, and they'll counsel them from a Christian perspective, and they'll talk about their spiritual life, and they may have, they go to chapel and so on. But what they teach in the classroom is just from the textbook. And so they're all teaching evolution, because that's what the textbooks teach. And the students go, okay, but how does that fit with God then? You know, if nature alone can do all the creating, what need is there for God? You know, the theory of evolution is claiming, I mean, Darwin, that's why Darwin proposed the theory. He says quite clearly in his own writings, you know, if you need God in there, like theistic evolution, if you've got God in there guiding the process, then you don't need natural selection. The whole point of natural selection was to say this is a purely material, mindless, purposeless, undirected process that will take the place of God. And so there is an inherent conflict when a Christian school says, we're Christian, but in the classroom we're going to just teach from the textbook. Well, so that would be an example where if you want to have a Christian mind, you need to go back and say, well, is there anything in science itself that seems to show that natural, undirected material causes don't do the job? Well, the answer is yes. I think the smoking gun is DNA. DNA is a message. It's a code. It's a language. It's a chemical language. Languages are not reducible to material. Matter doesn't give instructions. C.S. Lewis puts it that way in one of his books. He says, matter doesn't give instructions. Matter doesn't give messages. Natural causes alone do not create messages, do not create codes. And so inherently, you've got a code, you've got something that's non-material, and material forces cannot explain them. And by the way, empirically too, if you mix up the starting ingredients, the building blocks say, of proteins. The first origin of life research was on proteins, because, you know, every cell in our body is made of proteins. And so they would mix the ingredients and try to get proteins. Well, you mix ingredients in the test tube, you don't get proteins. We know this experimentally as well as conceptually. You don't get proteins. So the big question in origin of life research today is, where does information come from? Well, how can we get information? I mean, information is a mental thing. And codes and languages are organized by dictionaries and grammars. Where does nature have dictionaries and grammars? How do you get a translation from DNA to proteins? It's a translation process. How do translators work? They use rules for if you want to go from German to English, you have rules of translation. Where do rules like that come from? So I think that once the question, how do we then develop a Christian mind, gets down to each field. You have to sort of work it out like that. You can't. It's great to go around saying Christianity applies to everything. Okay, but now when the rubber hits the road, how do we do it in each particular field? Yeah, Frankie. So when I was at L'Abri, everyone already knew Frankie had a problem. Frankie was only he was in his early 20s. I mean, he might have been 21. He was very young. But he was already married because his girlfriend had gotten pregnant. So they got married. But even then, people were saying, what's with Frankie? Because he was so obviously angry and so obviously had a chip on his shoulder. And for the people who worked at L'Abri, here's kind of the story I got. Schaefer had 3 older daughters. And they were old enough that when they started L'Abri, the daughters felt like they were part of the ministry. And they've all stayed Christian. Frankie was young enough that he felt the ministry competed with the kind of attention he still needed from his parents. And I think there's some truth to that. I mean, that does happen with pastors and missionaries, and it does happen. I make this personal. My father's father, my dad's father, was a Bible school teacher, and he did it. He lost all his kids. All 5. He had 5 kids. All of them left the faith because he was so wedded to his Bible school and to his teaching, and he neglected his family. So there was some of that, I think. In fact, when Frankie got a little old, so Frankie had kind of the worst of both worlds. He was neglected, and then he was not disciplined. So it was a permissive neglect. And Oz Guinness, you know Oz Guinness? So Oz was teaching at L'Abri when I was there. And he wrote an article about it, and if you really want to get a good description of what happened to Frankie, you should read the article. It was in Books and Culture, Oz Guinness. The title was Fathers and Sons. And the reason he wrote it is that Books and Culture wrote a very positive review of one of Frankie's books. And Oz just couldn't let that go, because it was destroying Francis Schaeffer's legacy. I mean, because Frankie had written so negatively about his parents. So Oz was very, very close to Frankie. He was his best man at his wedding. So I think Oz, I think that's credible. What he wrote is credible. He said Frankie was neglected. He said, we called him the little king because he was so spoiled. He walked around L'Abri acting like he could do whatever he wanted. And then as he became a teenager, he began seducing the female students. Finally, his parents sent him off to boarding school. They decided he wasn't getting enough structure in the little French, the French-speaking part of Switzerland. He wasn't getting enough structure at the little French school. So they sent him to boarding school in England. Well, I don't know if you know from missionary stories, a lot of times when you send a kid to boarding school, he feels like he's being rejected. Well, Frankie definitely felt that. He ran away from boarding school within a week, hitchhiked his way back to L'Abri, walked into the chalet, which was his home, and was met by a student worker saying, "Hello, may I help you?" This is my home, And he's met by a stranger saying, "Can I help you?" So you can kind of see why this was difficult for him. I have some sympathy I think he was not, I think he did get sort of lost in the shuffle with the parents' ministry. But I do think it's tragic that he has done more to discredit his parents than any secular critic. But I guess the lesson from that is, if you're in ministry, don't let the ministry cause you to neglect your kids. Anything else? We got a lot of political. Oh, we already have that. Disagreement? You mean like with, disagreement with a secular person who's asking me a question? Or... I'm not quite sure what to think of that question. I'll give you an answer. I'm not sure if this is quite what you're looking for. When you read Love Thy Body, a lot of people have noted that the tone is very warm and personal. And that's because I know people in every chapter. In every chapter, I know people who, with abortion, homosexuality, transgender. I know people who've gone through the experience, and many of the experiences were very painful. So I know people who've struggled with homosexuality, and I know them very personally. So I'll take that as sort of a personal thing there. That working with people who are, who are Christian, most of them were Christian, or at least thought they were Christian. Maybe they needed deeper understanding. Some of them were my students. Some of them were in my family. My family or extended family. When I did a reading group with a group of women who are grad students, I had 8 women. 3 of them had abortions. 3 out of 8 women had abortion. 2 of them were before they converted to Christianity. They were adult converts, but one of them when she was Christian. And she lied about it at first. Some issue had come up, and she said, well, I've never had an abortion, but... And then 2 weeks later, she said, I lied. I did have an abortion. She was raped on a Christian college campus, where she was a student, in her dorm room by a former boyfriend who was angry at her for breaking up with him. And that's why she let him in, because it was not a stranger, it was a former boyfriend. And he put a drug in her drink. But she didn't totally lose consciousness. She was kind of in and out of consciousness, so she was aware of what happened, and she got pregnant. And her first thought was, my church will shun my family. My church will shun my parents. And to avoid that, she signed up for the first available abortion appointment and got an abortion. And she was pro-life. She thought it was wrong. And she's pro-life today. So her fear of her family suffering was enough to override her moral convictions. So it was stories like that that have informed my writing of Love Thy Body, the painful stories that I got from people. And I'm going to tell you one more, too, the transgender chapter, because most of us perhaps don't know transgender people. So I have to tell you this one. The opening story, each chapter has kind of an extended opening story, and this is the longer opening story. So this is somebody I know very well who, from the time he was quite young, he clearly had gender dysphoria. He wasn't even walking yet. He was still crawling when his babysitter told his mom, he's too good to be a boy. Meaning, he's gentle and compliant and sweet-natured, more the stereotype of a girl. In preschool, while the boys roughhouse on one side of the room and the girls sat in a little circle and talked, he was always with the little girls, invariably. By elementary school, he was telling his parents, I think like a girl, I feel like a girl. God should have made me a girl. And it was very painful. You know, he's crying, he's weeping when he's saying this. By age 14, he's scouring the internet for information on sex change surgery. Just to give you a sense, that true gender dysphoria, well, the last time I talked to him, he was in his early 20s. He graduated from college with honors. He did very well. And I thought he was okay. I thought he was over it because he did decide not to transition. And at the end of our conversation, he tapped his chest like this and said, "But I'm still a girl on the inside." And I thought, this is really intractable. This is difficult. So how did his parents respond? His parents responded by, number one, always making sure he knew he was loved. I have heard stories from people who said their parents were upset with them for not being masculine enough, or for girls not being feminine enough. A friend of mine who was gay said, I loved art and poetry, and my dad was always trying to toughen me up by making me go out to sports. And his parents did not do that. They made sure they kept telling him. He would say, I don't fit the stereotypes. He didn't fit the John Wayne masculinity stereotype. And his parents would say, it's not you that's wrong, it's the stereotypes that are wrong. It's perfectly possible to be an emotional, sensitive, caring, nurturing boy. God has equipped you for maybe one of the caring professions, psychologist or healthcare worker. They kept, because he's still, even now as a young adult, most of his friends are girls. He just has the characteristics, the personality characteristics that are more common of girls. But it was a long, painful process. They took him through personality tests like the Myers-Briggs. Any of you taken the Myers-Briggs? Because the Myers-Briggs shows that you can be, an assertive, take-charge woman or man, and you can be a gentle, sensitive, relational male. So they took him through that, and they fortunately they had friends where the man was the man was an INFP, so he's way over on the nurturing side, and the woman was an ISTJ, so she was just take charge, organize things, make it happen. So and this couple had gone through marriage counseling for years, and they always fit the opposite stereotype. He always fit the feminine stereotypes, and she always fit the masculine stereotypes. And finally they were just throwing books across the room. They were so frustrated until they found a therapist who worked with the Myers-Briggs. And he said, it's okay for you to be contrary to the normal stereotypes. And so this was one of their family friends, and the parents pointed it out. Look, see, this guy is it's like you. He's this gentle, nurturing guy, but he's fully masculine. So the parents worked with him and worked with him and worked with him, and fortunately, he finally decided. Therapy. I keep saying therapy. Surgery would not give him what he wanted. That's how he put it. It would not make me a girl. Every cell has a sex. Surgery doesn't change every cell in your body. And the way he put it is, he's kind of a computer geek. He said, a person is not like a computer disk that you can erase and start over again. So because I was very close to this family, when the question was what was difficult and painful, this was difficult and painful. Working with this young man because he felt so strongly that he didn't fit in with other guys. Other guys talked about sports and video games and their favorite bands. And girls talk about feelings and relationships, and that's what he's interested in. So all through his life, this was very painful. He cried a lot. And so this is what we need to keep in mind when we deal with these issues, is to remember that as you stand firm for a biblical truth, you need to realize that these are very painful for people who are personally struggling with it, and we need to always keep in mind the real people behind the issues. Yes, there are activists on both sides, and they are tough, and trans activists are really aggressive. And we need people who are out there who are the, sort of the fighter types who can fight on the public arena. But then we need the people who are pastoral, who are working with them one by one. And, and the church has to have a pastoral tone, welcoming them, working with them, nurturing them, supporting them. People say the church is a hospital for sinners, right? But if you want to attract patients, they have to know that they can bring their brokenness to the church, and the church will nurture them and help them and protect them.